Hello, thank you for joining us tonight on this episode of Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman. I'm going to be your host for today's episode. Today we are talking with David Pacheco. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
David is the current president, and you're one of the founding members of the Minnesota Chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Let's see, you've worked with groups in both California and here in Minnesota on religious freedom issues, which we'll get into in just a second. That includes, you did some training work back in 2002 for the Minnesota United campaign to prevent marriage restriction.
That's correct.
You were pretty successful at that.
We like to think so.
Yeah. So today we're going to cover four basic things. You're going to give us a brief history of Americans United. We're going to talk about issues that the group focused on in the calendar year 2015. We're going to talk about what's ahead for 2015. As we record this right now, it's just the beginning of 2016.
Yep.
And then we're going to talk about how we could get involved with Americans United.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Okay,
Sounds
so let's just start right in, and why don't you bring everyone up to speed on what is Americans United, a brief history.
Sure. Americans United for Separation of Church and State is a nonpartisan educational organization, a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to preserving what we consider a very critical constitutional principle, which is church and state separation, as we find in the First Amendment. And we believe that principle of separation is really the only way to ensure religious freedom from everybody in the United States, no matter what religion they have or whether if they have no religion. The only way to really protect that practice is for the government to really stay out of it, to not promote, to not oppose, to not bring up and to not suppress any religious practice or lack of practice. And so the organization started actually back in 1947. Based in Washington, D.C. And the reason it started was because back in 1947, at the time, there were a lot of proposals that were pending in U.S. Congress that would allow for extending of government aid to religious organizations, to private religious schools in that particular case. And a lot of people were concerned about that. There was a lot of history in the early days of the United States where states had official churches. Mm-hmm. And that caused a lot of problems, especially with taxation and suppression of people that did not belong to that church. And so the United States Constitution, when the Bill of Rights came along, obviously the First Amendment declaring that Congress could not put in place any law that would either promote or suppress any particular religion. That was considered critically important because of those issues, and it was extended. It started obviously out as something that affected the federal government, but then was extended through the 14th Amendment to all state legislatures as well. And a lot of Americans opposed the idea at the time, back in 1947, to have the government be providing aid, financial aid, to religious organizations, because that support for that religious organization would violate that church and state separation. And so the decision was made at that time to form a national organization to promote this point of view and to participate in courts, in Congress, in state legislatures, at the White House, obviously, and in the arena of public opinion in promoting this idea of keeping church and state separate.
So was that opposition in the 40s, was that largely non-religious people who didn't want to see religion encroaching on them, or was it people of varying religions that didn't want to see one trumping another one?
It was a combination of both.
Okay.
It was religious people, and in fact, even today, I mean, our current leader is the Reverend Barry Lynn, who is a reverend, and we have a lot of religious members. And really, one of the things that causes confusion sometimes is that people look at Americans United as an anti-religious group, and nothing could be farther from the truth. The concept of religious freedom means allowing everybody to practice their religion, and as long as it doesn't come into conflict with the rights of somebody else who may practice a different religion, who may have no religion at all. And so a lot of the cases that have come up since 1947, and definitely in 2015 and 2016, have to do with where are those limits? Where are the limits of allowing somebody to practice their religion and live their lives according to their religious conscience without stepping on the rights of others? This has come up a lot over the past year, especially after the same-sex marriage ruling from the Supreme Court in 2015, where there's a lot of discussion going on right now about where do those limits end, where do my rights start and end, where do your rights start and end. And it has to do a lot with what can the government do to really step out of the way and not get involved, but still protect the rights of those who want to practice their freedom, of religious freedom, or in some cases to be free of religion in places where they don't want them to be imposed.
So do you think the issues that you see have become more complicated, more muddied as the decades have gone on and it's become a more diverse nation?
I think definitely what we have today is that religious freedom is starting to mean something a little bit wider than what most people expected it to be. Thanks to the Christian majority in this country, that has been what religious freedom is defined as. The definition is to be free to be a Christian. And as the country changes, as immigration changes, and as different religions become more popular, suddenly that is being challenged quite a bit. And in fact, a lot of the cases we see become a lot more complicated when suddenly somebody who was fighting for religious freedom comes to understand that that means that somebody who doesn't belong to their religion also will have the same freedom. There have been some cases over the past few years, for example, in Florida, where people were told, no, you have to allow this to happen because it allows for religious freedom. And then when it was realized by the people passing the law that this would also allow Muslims or Buddhists or Zoroastrians or people of any religion or atheists to experience and take advantage of those same freedoms, suddenly they would back off. They would say, "Oh, maybe this wasn't that great an idea," which is amusing to watch from the outside as people realize religious freedom does not mean Christian religious freedom. It means freedom for everybody, and including freedom from religion as well. And we actually work with the Freedom from Religion Foundation in some of the cases that they have involved. There was a case last year in Minnesota, actually, that involved collaboration between the two groups. But things have changed. I'm not sure I would say they've gotten worse or they've gotten better. The cases since 1947 have included cases about prayer in schools, which was incredibly contentious, and still even today resonates with a lot of people who claim that the Supreme Court has prohibited prayer in school. It's absolutely untrue. A child can pray in school, a child can bring their Bible, a child can even discuss religious matters in their homework and in their essays, as long as they meet the requirements of the homework or the work that they've been requested to do. But it does become this point of saying, no, religion is being suppressed because we can't force children to say a prayer at the beginning of schools, which is what happened a lot back in the 50s and 60s. You would start the day with a Bible reading. You would start the day with a prayer. And these prayers were very specifically sectarian. Even if as the argument went, most of the kids in the school were Christian, some of them were were members of religion that did not allow for that kind of public prayer and that public expression of religion. And so they were some of the groups that actually brought the first cases to say we should not have public school government officials forcing the children to recite a particular pledge, a particular prayer, a particular reading for a very sectarian, very specific version of Christianity because it offends their religious sensibilities as well. So things have changed over the years. I'm not sure I would say they're more complex now. I think they're definitely different.
Definitely different, yeah.
And as the nature of our community changes, and as we bring in and welcome groups that have very, very different religious beliefs, things come in conflict.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, it's a complex situation because it's very hard to measure sometimes where that dividing line sits between my religious freedom and your religious freedom and your civil rights.
Sounds like we could do a whole show just about some of the more interesting cases over the past half century. But today we'll focus just on the last year.
Yes.
So we'll keep that in mind for a future
Absolutely.
episode. But today what I wanted to get into the meat of the program was what are some of the major cases that Americans United have addressed in 2015?
Well, in 2015, I think the main case and the case that is still resonating today, there's echoes of this going on today, is the Supreme Court case on marriage equality. This was the Obergefell versus Hodges case. And it really, unfortunately, has driven the religious right to go ballistic because by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court in June extended marriage equality to to same-sex couples nationwide. Even in several states that had passed constitutional amendments or legislation that prohibited same-sex marriage, in some cases by significant vote differences, 70% to 30%. And this has caused huge concerns in the religious right. Even though nothing in the decision actually requires any house of worship to perform these marriages, or even to recognize them within that religious organization, it has been problematic. And what it has led to is a whole series of what are being called refusal cases. And this is where government officials have been either asking for the freedom to not participate or to not recognize or solemnize these marriages. And we've seen the case of County Clerk Kim Davis in Kentucky as an example, but also business owners who are insisting that they have a religious freedom right to refuse services to LGBT couples. And in response, actually, Americans United has launched a new project, which is called Protect Thy Neighbor. And this is to assist people who feel that their rights have been denied on religious grounds. But that is probably the most significant case from 2015, and will be the one that resonates the most throughout the course of the next few years, because there are all of these subsequent cases, Religious Freedom Restoration Act cases that are being proposed in multiple states, 27 states just between last year and this year, that are winding their way through the legislations to see what happens. And obviously 2015 saw the beginning of the presidential campaign. And there have been a lot of very troubling comments made during the campaign regarding religious freedom. The GOP frontrunner has said that, made a couple of proposals, including closing down mosques, including barring Muslims from traveling into the United States. So very much religiously based discrimination. And as I said earlier, Americans United is not about suppressing or promoting any particular religion, but is really saying the government shouldn't be involved in that. The government shouldn't be making decisions about citizenship, about who has the right to worship and where, based on discrimination against a particular form of religion. So the senators and the other members of the presidential campaigns have made some other very troubling comments too, including overturning the Supreme Court ruling on same-sex marriage, or in one case, at least one presidential candidate has said that only people of faith should be president, in spite of the fact that the Constitution itself, that there must be no test of faith in order to be a member of the legislature or any kind of public body.
So what sort of action can Americans United take with that? I mean, if I'm running for president and I say all sorts of crazy things, it's my legal right to do that, and I might not get voted in anyway.
Sure.
So when you hear those things, do you just think this is just a blustery politician trying to score some votes, or someone who's just trying to get some attention, and maybe this person won't even score their own party's nomination, much less the win anyway, so maybe we don't need to put too much time, energy, money, sweat into this yet, or what?
Well, it's concerning because these people get a lot of support. And as citizens who are agreeing with these ideas, their legislators, even though the presidential candidate may not win, they still vote for local legislature. They still vote for senators. They still vote for congresspeople. They still vote for school council members and their local mayors and their local governors. And if they are supporting these ideas and they ask for these things to be put in place locally, it's obviously still a concern. So there's a lot of education here that goes on, and one of the primary efforts that Americans United participates in is an educational one, to tell people this is what can and cannot be done. This is what is constitutional. This is what is unconstitutional when it comes to that kind of separation issue. So while we can't definitely step into any kind of presidential election and say you can no longer say that, people have freedom of speech. They can say whatever they want. But we do want to be able to remind people what can be done and what cannot be done under the U.S. Constitution as it currently sits. There are a lot of things that we talk about saying, this candidate has said this, but this is unconstitutional. We can't, as a 501c3, we can't promote or speak out against any particular candidate, but we can address the issues. We can say, this proposal is unconstitutional. This proposal violates the separation of church and state. The proposal to say that only the only people who can be president are people of faith is absolutely unconstitutional. And that helps educate people. That helps them understand where the country stands, where the Constitution stands on these issues. And it's actually quite surprising to see how many people don't know that, and how many people don't know how much protection they have themselves in their beliefs, in their religious practice, or in their lack of faith or lack of belief, and what rights they have, what things they can stand up for. This is especially of concern in schools. There are public schools as funded by taxpayer money. The people who work for them are, in that sense, government employees. And so they have to respect that. And that is probably where a lot of the most problematic situations have come up over the past couple of years. Freedom of speech of students, when compared to freedom of religion of other students. It came up last year in Minnesota with the bullying campaign to promote legislation, the anti-bullying legislation. Religious opposition to that was significant because there were religious organizations that said, well, if I'm expressing my religious opinion, and my religious opinion is that same-sex marriage is a sin, that being homosexual is a sin, and I'm repeatedly saying that to another student, you can't call that bullying because it's my religious freedom. And again, as we talked earlier, this is where we start talking about the civil rights of one person, the religious rights of one person to express themselves, First Amendment rights of freedom of expression, versus that other child's right to not be bullied, to not be made to feel lesser than, to not to be in an educational environment where they feel that they cannot express themselves either, or they cannot be who they really are.
Is it, so here's where I guess it gets a little bit muddied. Is it possible to somehow educate people or try to get the courts to draw a distinction between, saying your opinion or your personal beliefs and then also bullying someone? I mean, I can think of two very different ways where I could tell someone I disagree with them. One is where I'm just saying, from what I've researched, I think that you're incorrect, or I could, punch them in the face and tell them they're a stupid moron with all sorts of, what I mean? I could really bully them.
Bullying is hard to define. And this is really why there was so much, that bullying legislation was so contentious, was because, and I would tend to agree with this, it doesn't clearly define this is bullying and this, and if you do this, you're beyond the line. And that's because it's very hard to do. If I just go up to you and express my opinion and I say this is what I think about same-sex marriage or divorce or single mothers, if I just come up and say that and then walk away, is that bullying? If I come up to you and I say it every day, does it become harassment? If I come up to you and deface your locker, then it becomes bullying. It's very hard to define. There's no clear defining line for these things, and this is why we tend to watch the courts to see how they respond to these things, because they have to look at the context of this particular case, but also how it will affect future cases and how it will affect kids who are on either side of this. I mean, we do have to protect the child who wants to express themselves religiously. We have to protect that. But we also have to protect the kids around them to make sure that they don't feel that their rights or their sensitivity, their religion is being suppressed, or their lack of religion is being suppressed because that person is constantly expressing an opinion that they find distasteful.
So there's 50 states. They're not all on the same page with everything, obviously, and that's fine. It's a diverse nation, and it's good, I think, to have certain say locally. So how do Americans United address the idea that there could be very differing opinions or statuses of legalities in different states?
Well, different states do have different constitutions, do have different legislations. Definitely Americans United at the national level is looking at things that are constitutional nationally. So the local chapters of Americans United, of which Minnesota has one, we are the groups that are supposed to be looking at what is happening from a legislature nature locally. And sometimes that does bring into conflict the state constitution versus the U.S. Constitution. And there are additional protections, for example, even in Minnesota, for religious freedom that go above and beyond those that are afforded by the U.S. Constitution. So freedom of conscience in the United States in Minnesota is actually more protected. And that has to be taken into consideration as well. Now, obviously, if something at a state constitutional level is considered unconstitutional at the federal level, the federal constitution, the U.S. Constitution, overrides.
Right.
And this is exactly what we saw with Obergefell versus Hodges, is the same-sex marriage suit, in that even though we had multiple states who, in their constitutions, had amendments that declared that this is the definition of what marriage is, and it has to be, two people of the opposite sex. When those were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court at a federal U.S. level, they were unconstitutional everywhere. So there's that balance as well of the state rights to promote their own welfare versus the U.S. Constitution, which is the law of the land and overrides anything that happens at the state level.
How do you feel Minnesota fits in the ranking, especially in regards same-sex equality, bullying, things we've talked about?
We're very, very fortunate to be in Minnesota for a lot of different reasons. We're not a state like Tennessee or Alabama or Indiana, all states who in the past year have attempted to or have successfully passed some of these religious freedom laws, which really allow people to, for example, not provide services to same-sex couples if they don't feel like it, if they feel their religious sensitivities will be offended. We don't really have that as much in Minnesota as exists in several of the other states. That being said, there is legislation that we're looking at for this year that has been introduced to offer that kind of quote-unquote religious freedom. It's really specific to saying if you disagree with same-sex marriage, if you disagree with homosexuality, you are allowed, for religious reasons, you are allowed to deny services to these people. And it's not just they can't have their wedding in my chapel, or they can't have their wedding in my hotel, or they can't have it in my restaurant. It really encompasses any service that could be provided to an LGBT couple based on religious discrimination. And so what these laws are trying to promote, or trying to allow, or in some cases even trying to enforce, is discrimination against same-sex couples on religious reasons. That basically anybody could decide to ignore any law if they feel that they're going to be forced to do something that their religion compels them not to. Those are extremely problematic because they're written in such a way that would allow somebody to take any law and say, I do not want to provide a service, I do not want to give you a license to marry, I do not want to give you a driver's license because my religious sensitivities will be offended by that fact. And so if you can think of, we can think of all kinds of cases, a Christian person or a Muslim trying to get a driver's license, and there are various different forms of Muslim faith that don't allow women to drive. And so if you could say at the DMV, I am not going to give you a driver's license because my faith does not allow you to drive, it's incredibly problematic, and these laws are written in such a wide way that they could allow that kind of discrimination.
I know my religious sensitivities allow me to park on the street even when there's a snow emergency.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I know that's going to butt heads with the locals officials.
I know if I could redefine the law according to whether I feel like I want to support it or not, and I could define my religion specifically to counter the laws I'm opposed to, I know that taxation would probably be the first law I would get rid of.
That's a biggie. Yeah.
Yes.
So we only have about 5 minutes left, but so I wanted to quickly touch on what are some things coming down the pipeline in the next calendar year here.
Sure. So we'll be looking at a lot of these Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. There's a lot of them going on. There is one that is happening or is attempting to be passed. It's in the Judiciary Committee right now in the Minnesota Senate. We're going to be looking at that one very closely. It's an election year. It's 2016. We are going to be looking at a lot of there are a lot of churches who in 2008 and 2012 decided that they didn't want to follow the law on supporting candidates or speaking out against candidates. As 501c3s, as nonprofit organizations, we are prohibited from specifically endorsing a particular candidate or talking out against a candidate. We can talk about issues. We can't say you must vote for this candidate. In 2008 and 2012, several churches decided that they were exempt from that, and that they were allowed to preach from the pulpit. So pulpit politics is going to be one of the pretty major ones that we're going to be looking at. We need to monitor occurrences of this, and this is one of the things we reach out to our members to. Obviously, we can't attend every religious service every week. We'd love to, but we can't. So we're asking our membership to inform us when they see that happening, because that does get the IRS involved, because it does affect their nonprofit and tax-exempt organizations. And we are looking at a lot of these promises that from candidates that violate church and state separation, making sure that we educate people about constitutionality. And we are also looking at cases like what we had in 2015 in Wadena, Minnesota, where we had a nativity display on public lands. Americans United got involved in that, sent out a letter to the city council, to the mayor, and we got them to take it down. That was immediately followed by almost the entire town of Wadena setting up nativities in their houses, in their homes and their businesses, which we thought was great. We thought it was fantastic because that's where religious practice should occur, not through the government, but through privately owned businesses and through private homes.
Okay, so let's say that I want to get involved more with Americans United or with these issues. What can I do, or where can I go?
There are multiple things you can do. Obviously, we want everybody to become a member of Americans United, and you can do that at the national organization's website, which is au.org. We also have a local website, mnau.org, and people can read up on what we're doing there. There are links to the national organization's blog, tons of resources. There's tons of places where you can go to learn about issues and where these defining lines are, especially at schools and religious freedom issues. So there's a lot of resources available on those two websites to do that. Also, Americans United last year launched a new campaign called Protect Thy Neighbor. And this is really about these laws that protect people's religious freedom and allowing people to participate by understanding what is going on at their local level, what laws are being proposed or being passed at the local legislature, and they can do that via the resources on the web pages, learn about what's happening in their state, but also learn who to contact and learn what they can do. There are scripts available to say, call your legislator, and this is what you want to say, talk about this particular bill, and here's why it's problematic. Those are the talking points that you can use when you're talking to that legislator.
Yeah, and we're putting the links on the screen for people in case they didn't quite catch them.
Fantastic. Everybody's welcome to join.
And let's say that someone thinks that they could be a better president of the Minnesota chapter than you. What can they do about that?
I am sure there are several people who could be. Actually, we will be holding elections very soon, and we will be informing people about that and the public meeting around it on our website, which again is mnau.org. So absolutely, we will actually have open positions, whether they want to be president or not. There are open positions that they can apply for and run for, and we will be holding the elections to allow that to happen. And if they become a member, they will also get our periodical, Church and State, which is also available.
I'll hold it up.
Thank you very much. I need that. So become a member today, obviously, and we would appreciate that. And any assistance that people can provide, they can also email us at info@mnau.org. All of these links are available through the website, too, to let us know what they see happening at their local level.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Talking about Americans United. Yeah, it was great. And thank you for watching our show. If you like what you saw, please contact us at the information you see on the screen. We would be happy to, see I was holding yours up just to warm up. We'd be happy to send you a copy of our newsletter free of charge just to see what we're all about, because if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. So thank you again.